So the filing status that's actually the most complex and the hardest to sometimes determine is the head of household. And the head of household filing status, you can use that status if you are unmarried or considered unmarried. And I'll go over some of these definitions, what it means, and on the last day of the year. Then the other criteria you have to fulfill is you have to pay more than half the cost of keeping up a home for the year. So I will go over what that means as well. And then you also have to have, the third one is a qualifying person that lived with you more than half a year. And except if you have a parent that could be your dependent who doesn't have to live with you. The parent could live in, let's say, senior facility or their own apartment or home. So all these criteria have to be fulfilled in order for you to qualify for head of household. So what does it mean when we say considered unmarried? Unmarried, that's simple enough, but considered unmarried? Considered unmarried for head of household filing status, it means you have to file separate returns. So you're married, but you're not filing together. You yourself have to pay more than half the cost of keeping up the home. And the spouse could not live with you in the past 6 months. So that means for 12 year, can't live with your spouse for the past 6 months. So on July 1st on, you could not live together. So in order for you to file as head of household, you have maintained home for a child, stepchild, a foster child, and for more than half a year. So the child, let's say if the child lived with you a bit and then lived with someone else, maybe the other spouse or grandparents or what have you, the child have to live with you more than half the year. So if the child has moved around, you have to make sure you do the calculation, and the child has to be your dependent. So there's some exceptions for spouses who divorced. Maybe previous spouse you divorced from, and the child is your dependent, but for that year the non-custodial parent is claiming them. So in that situation, it could be an exception. But that's what basically considered unmarried means. You're married, but you're not filing together. You paid more than half the cost of keeping up your home. Your spouse didn't live with you in the past 6 months, so that's important, and you have a home that you maintain for a child or a dependent. Now, what does it mean, cost of keeping up home? So this is from publication 17, IRS publication 17 and publication 501. Those are the ones that I would recommend if you have any questions. They're actually in somewhat clear language, and they're geared towards answering the basic questions. So this is really helpful. These are helpful publications to refer to if you have more questions. But this is an example from this publication to kind of show you what happens. Let's say if you living with someone else and you want to claim head of household, what kind of calculation would you have to do to determine if you paid more than half of the cost of keeping up a home? So things that you would consider are like property taxes, mortgage interest expenses, rent if you don't own a home, utility charges, repairs and maintenance for the household, property insurance, food eaten in the home, specifically not outside, other household expenses. And you would totally, total this up and then compare to the total cost for the household, because maybe you're living with a parent and you are also paying, and you have a child, let's say a dependent. Then you want to split it and see who paid more than half. And in this situation that we have here, the total cost was $39,480, but you paid $20,200, so that's 51%. So you consider to pay more than half. So in this example, this would fulfill that requirement. Now, it's important to note, per the IRS publication 17, you do not include expenses for clothing, education expenses, medical treatment, vacations, and life insurance or transportation. So, just refer to the publication if you're not sure what you can include in the calculation. Now, how you determine who's the qualifying person? So it's also in publication 17 where you find this definition of who's your qualifying child as well as a qualifying relative, and based on this condition, if you can claim qualifying child as your dependent. So in both situations, they have to be citizen, U.S. citizen, resident alien, or resident of Canada or Mexico. They have to be related to you by blood or adoption. Could be a stepchild, foster child, brother, sister, or any descendants of them. Must be under 19 or younger than you. So in this situation, when you, let's say, remarry and your spouse is much older than you, they might have children that are about your age. So you have to consider that. The child, the qualifying child can be under 24 if they're full-time student, or any age if they're permanently disabled. Now, they have to live with you more than half a year, as we mentioned previously, so it's kind of like reiteration of these rules. They cannot provide more than half of his or her support, and you can think about that because we're talking about, let's say, children who are 23, maybe full-time student, but they might have a job, and if they provided more than half of their own support, you would not be able to claim them as a qualifying child. They cannot be filing a joint return because, again, they could be 22 and married, and no one else can claim the child. So for small children or younger children, no one can claim them. Now, you could also use the qualifying relative option to, if your dependent is not the qualifying child. So they also have to be U.S. citizen, a resident of Canada or Mexico. It can be a qualifying child, and they have to be related to you or must live with you all year. And their gross income can be more than $4,300, and you must provide half of their support. So actually, if you go through the publication 501, there's a table that specifically goes through different examples and to figure out if the qualifying person, which is the dependent that we're talking about, can qualify you for head of household. So let's just go over quickly. If the person, is your child, son, daughter, and they're single, they are a qualifying person. If they're married and you can claim them as a dependent, they can also be a qualifying person. But they're married and you can't claim them as a dependent, that they're not qualifying you for head of household. If they're qualifying relative, who is your father and mother, and this is a specific situation, we talked about it, that they don't have to necessarily live with you, but you can still, some situation, claim them as a dependent. And you can claim them as a dependent, they're a qualifying person, but if you can't claim them as a dependent, they're not a qualifying person, which is kind of like duh, right? But okay, now this example, the next one, is more complicated. So if it's a relative other than yourself, such as grandparents, brother or sister, who meet certain tests, and she or he lived with you more than half the year, and is related to you, then could be a qualifying person. If they didn't live with you more than half a year, not a qualifying person because it doesn't fulfill that requirement. And it's not related to you. You see, that's an important one. For head of household, they have to be related to you. Then they're not qualifying person. And you can't claim them as a dependent, then obviously it's not a qualifying person. So that was kind of like helpful in some of these more complicated situations. You can go over to determine if this person is a qualifying person. So let's just go over a couple of examples to clarify some of this. So we have a situation where you have an unmarried son who lived with you all year. He's 18 years old and he didn't provide more than half of his own support. Can you file head of household? Yes, you can. He is your qualified child because he's under 19 and under 24 if he was full-time student, and didn't provide more than half of his own support. So if other criteria are met, the situation is fulfilled for head of household filing status. Now another example, similar, but now the son is 25 years old and earned over $5,000. Now you cannot file head of household in this situation because he's not your qualified child anymore. He's over 19. He's over 24 as a full-time student, so that criteria is not met, and he made more than $5,000. Now, what about if you live with your girlfriend all year long? That will not qualify you for head of household. She is not related to you. So that's a situation that comes often. People want to claim their girlfriend or boyfriend for head of household, but that won't work. Now, what about if your girlfriend's son was living with you all year? Now, he is not your qualifying child because she is claiming him, unless she's not. But in this situation, we don't know other information. If she is claiming the child, then obviously you wouldn't be able to file as head of household. So these examples are in the publication 17 or 5 of 1. Let me just check briefly. Let me see, which was it? Head of household. We went through some example. Yep, so this is in publication 17, and you see these are the examples that I kind of put together in the presentation to kind of summarize them. Now, what about if your mother, who you claim as a dependent, lived in an apartment by herself, and she was your dependent again, and she passed, let's say in September, mid-year, and the cost for the apartment was $6,000, you paid $4,000, your brother paid $2,000, and your mom had no income, so maybe she was on Social Security but no other income. So in this situation, you paid more than half of the cost of keeping up your mother's apartment, right? $6,000 was the total for the apartment, and you paid $4,000, so that's more than half, and you were able to claim her as a dependent. So in this situation, you could file as head of household on this, based on this example. Now, things to consider when you're filing head of household. It's one of the most audited filing status because, you know, the credits and deduction we talked about that are higher for that status than, let's say, if you're filing single, and it's often being filed incorrectly. Now, paid preparers need to perform due diligence on Form 8867. And so what you might find if you go to like paid tax preparer, they might ask you a lot of questions. You're like, why are they asking me all these questions? Because they have to fulfill that requirement because of you know, this filing status being audited so often and being filed incorrectly. So they might ask some additional questions to determine that you can use this filing status. And one thing that you can consider, if you actually look at Form 886-H-HOH, so this kind of like goes over the criteria to file head of household, and this is actually a document that IRS uses if they, you know, if you file that head of household filing status and IRS has questions or needs to determine to make sure that it's correct filing status, because let's say you filed single, then head of household, and you know, the child is 10 or something like that. So they might ask you to provide some documentation. So if you use this form, like it goes over some of the things that you might be asked to provide to IRS. So for example, for marriage test, you know, you might want some documents to prove that you did not live with your spouse for the past 6 months of the year. If you have qualifying person, that make sure that the child, let's say, reside at your address, you might have to have school or medical records or birth certificates and so on. Cost of keeping up a home, they might ask you to provide utility bills, rent receipts, and so on. So kind of this document helps you see what information you should have. And if you have that information and you can use the filing status, then you should file it because it's more beneficial for you. But you just want to be aware what would be asked for. So thanks so much for watching.